Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining with me as we continue our verse-by-verse daily devotionals going through the book of Proverbs. We're in chapter 7. We're going to pick up our reading today in verse 14, and so I hope that you'll find this will be a helpful and edifying time of reflecting upon what the Word of God says about how we interact with the world on a daily basis. Well, where we left off, Solomon was warning his son about sexual temptation. He was talking about the immoral woman, the adulterous woman more particularly, but any kind of sexual immorality. And he was saying that basically there's almost a predatory dynamic to it, that there is this kind of spiritual dimension in a person's life who pursues to draw people into their sin. And it's interesting because, sin loves company. We have this saying that misery loves company, but the truth of the matter is that the misery that comes as a result of sin often tries to address that misery by convincing somebody else to join with them in their misery. And so it's that need for companionship, that need for partnership, which is a valid and healthy need that God put in us, is basically sometimes can be twisted so that when we find ourselves in broken relationships and broken fellowship with God in particular, that we try to find comfort in drawing somebody else into our sin, so that if you have a problem with alcohol, you don't want to drink alone, you want to have other people join with you, as if their engagement in your excesses is something that makes your behavior okay. And it's kind of like the thing that we used to always say to our parents when we were kids. We'd say, everybody is doing it. And as my pastor said, he would tell his mom that, and she would say, well, any old dead fish can float downstream. It takes a live one to fight the current. And I always thought that was just really good basic advice for all of us, that we find that in this world, which is a world that has a proclivity for sin, has taken many people captive to sinful behavior. There's a spiritual dynamic, the spirit of darkness, the spirit of this world, Satan, if you will, who is often trying to get us into an adversarial relationship with God and convince us to rebel against his guidance, his counsel, his rules, his laws, his paths of life, if you will, that because of that constant struggle that you and I face on a daily basis, it's really easy for us to become susceptible to temptation and to be drawn away from the path. And there's probably no greater area of weakness, especially in younger people's lives, than that of sensual desires, sensual temptation. And particularly in an era like we're living right now in our country, where basically love has become synonymous with sex, even though the Bible makes a big distinction between those two. But we begin to treat them as being essentially the same thing. If you love me, you'll have sex with me. And as a consequence, we find that there's a sensual shallowness, if you will, to so many relationships. As soon as the relationship becomes sensually unsatisfying, then people want to move on to another relationship to have a new kind of thrill, a new kind of experience, and that will endure until they tire of it. And that's part of what we find in going on in the society today, where not only are people looking for very short-term relationships, but even avoiding marriage itself because it has such a long-term personal, emotional, and psychological, spiritual, as well as legal encumbrance. It legally becomes bound to another person, so it's easier to just shack up, to live together. This is particularly attractive to men who don't want to take the full responsibility. And the thing that you find about people who are living together outside of marriage is that they're still shopping. They say that you wouldn't buy a car without first getting a test drive. And essentially they say the same thing is true about marriage. And so they say, I don't want to marry somebody until I know whether I can live with them. The problem is that when you're test driving a car, you have no responsibility for its maintenance. You don't have any responsibility for its care. Essentially, you don't have to be responsible for fueling it and keeping it going or keeping it clean. And that's the difference. When you buy it, you own it. Now it's your responsibility to maintain it. The same thing is true in marriage, and that's why people don't want to do it. If I could simply have a car dealership deliver me a car every day and say, drive this as long as you want. When you get tired of it, just tell us and we'll take it home. Well, that would be great. But the simple fact is they're not going to do that because it's not a very good business plan for them. And so they want me to buy it and take responsibility now for its insurance, for its fueling, for its care, its maintenance, and so forth. Well, it's not that different when you're talking about marriage. People want to avoid the commitment, and they want to be able to keep on shopping around. And so this is one of those hidden dynamics of people who are living together outside of marriage. That one or both of them has never really committed and are really kind of keeping their options open. So there's never really a complete surrender of myself over to this other person. And oftentimes when one party begins to say, well, you owe this to me, they'll simply say, wait, I'm not married. I don't owe you anything. And that becomes really the danger, because in order for a marriage to survive, in order for society to survive and thrive, we need to have strong families where both a man and woman are committed to one another until death do them part, and who are committed to raising the children that come as a consequence, and to take responsibility for their education, their health, their feeding, their clothing, their shelter, to take responsibility to care for them, and so that they can launch successfully into life and help prepare the next generation to carry on. That's why it's very common to see that when marriages begin to fall apart, particularly when divorce becomes very prevalent in any society throughout all of history, we find that society is beginning to go into a collapse and a decay. And most great nations and empires never collapsed from the outside. I mean, there were outside forces that were pushing in, but as long as they were healthy and they were strong, they're basically functional, they were able to keep those forces at bay. It's when they became dysfunctional internally that everything began to collapse. And sadly, that's one of the things I fear that we're seeing in our society today in the United States of America. We see this amazing amount of incredible dysfunctionality from people. We might want to say that they're mentally ill. They're not really mentally ill. They just have personality disorders. In other words, their personality is formed after something that isn't functional and isn't real. And so as a result, they're very angry and frustrated and are striking out. So all of these things that Solomon's talking about, this fidelity in marriage, is such a serious issue. And I often point out that adultery is it's a marriage killer, because it breaks the trust and it makes it very difficult for a marriage to go forward, especially with any kind of stability or peace, because there's always this sense, can I trust you to be faithful to me at all times through the rest of your life? And that's why Solomon goes into such detail talking to his son, saying, here are the things you need to watch for. Because not only do you have to look at your own wandering desires, your own sinful nature will do that, but you also have to be aware that there are people who are very predatorial and who are looking to find comfort in taking advantage of you relationally, emotionally, physically, sexually, and so forth. And so he warns him about these kind of people. And one of the things he talks about is really kind of the spiritual deception that sometimes people put forth, where he says in chapter 7, verse 14, this adulterous or immoral woman comes up to him and says, I have fellowship offerings at home, and today I have fulfilled my vow. And so I came out to meet you, and I looked for you, and I found you. What I find fascinating is that, well, it might be a little complicated, because when this woman says, I have fellowship, or we would also call them peace offerings at home, what we understand is that a fellowship or a peace offering was a sacrifice that was made in the temple. And what separated it from a lot of sacrifices was that a portion of it was burnt on the altar, in a sense given to God. A portion of it would be given to the priests, and then the whole bigger portion would be given to the person who made the offering, and they could take that home and they could cook it and have a feast for all their friends and family. And usually that's what it implied, because they didn't have a means of storing meat for long periods of time. And so they would bring it home, they would roast it, invite all their friends and family, and it created fellowship not only with God and with the priest, but also with one another. And so this was an important thing. And keep in mind that eating meat was quite the luxury in those days. But then she secondly says, today I have fulfilled my vows. Now, what is that referring to? Well, most likely it's talking about the purity laws, where under the Levitical law, a woman was unclean during the period of her menstruation. In fact, she was unclean not only during that week of menstruation, but also for 7 days afterwards. At that time, in Leviticus 15, it says that she can't have any sexual relationships because she couldn't go into the temple because she was ritually unclean. She would have to go and wash herself, be cleansed in a mikveh, in a holy pool, and then go and offer a sacrifice to God to remove from her uncleanness. And so this idea of I've fulfilled my vows, basically she's saying to this young man, my waiting time for sexual intimacy is past. I've gone to the temple and I've been before God. My sins have been removed. I've made my offerings, my burnt offerings. And now I am ritually clean and I'm lawfully available for sexual intimacy. But the problem is that she's not lawfully available for sexual intimacy with anyone, but only with her husband. And so this is where the deception really begins to set in, because we always have to keep in mind that doing two right things doesn't make one wrong thing right. She was married to another man, and what she's committing is adultery. So what it's really describing is a strategic and manipulative communication. It's meant to give the appearance that she is a religious, pious person, but all she's doing is masking her immoral intentions and giving the appearance of piety under a cloak of seduction. Well, long explanation. We'll pick this up tomorrow as we continue in verse 15. Thank you for following along. God bless you.